Thank you for joining us. I just will introduce our guest, and then I'm going to go sit and enjoy the show myself. Pete Fornatale was one of the architects of progressive rock FM radio in the 1960s. He has been a fixture on New York radio for 40 years at WFUV, WNEW-FM, and K-Rock. His award-winning radio program, Mixed Bag, can be heard live every Saturday afternoon from 4 to 8 p.m. on WFUV in New York and streaming on the web at WFUV.org. He is the author of several books about media, pop culture, and music, and he's here today to talk about the subject matter of his latest book, Back to the Garden, The Story of Woodstock, which is now out in paperback. On a personal note, as Pete was beginning his career in radio, he was also working as a teacher at Maria Regina High School in Uniondale, right? That's right. And it's no longer there, I believe. Among his students was one Denise DeGrazia, who later became Denise Smith, and also later became my 7th grade teacher. So I just want to take a moment to thank you, Pete, for indirectly teaching me everything I learned in the 7th grade.
Absolutely.
Thank you. New York radio icon, broadcasting legend, Nobel Prize winner. I have to check my sources on that one. Here he is, music historian Pete Fornatale.
That's exactly why you can't trust Wikipedia. So don't do it. I'm sorry we're a little bit late, but the New York State Thruway's closed, man. I want to thank Mike once again, 2 years later, for that lovely and gracious introduction. I have learned over the years that you cannot count on an introduction like that at every appearance, so I always bring along a backup with me as a safety. Would you like to see that one, Tony?
And we continue now with our look at radio wars with two New York City disc jockeys who are on decidedly different wavelengths, both literally and figuratively, I presume. One is AM, the other one is FM, and that's only begins to tell the story of their different views of the medium. Howard Stern is a jock at Top 40 WNBC. His nickname, How Weird, sums up his kind of free-for-all on-the-air patter where just about anything goes. On the other hand, there's Pete Fornatale, who's been with the progressive rock radio station WNEW-FM since 1969, and I've known him since that time too. He's the co-author of Radio in the Television Age. Let's get the report from the front lines.
I hate this guy. I hate him.
Do you really?
I could take him in 3 rounds. I could beat him. I could beat him in 3.
As you can tell, everyone, this is going to be quite an hour here. All right, but seriously, folks.
Now, as some of you may know, I ended up following Howard for 5 years at K-Rock, which I now consider to be punishment for sins committed in some past life that I don't remember. But that's the way it was, and back then, there really were wars, radio wars, between AM and FM, between top 40 music and progressive FM rock. Nothing captured that better than what I'm about to show you by the great Dan Aykroyd from Saturday Night Live. One of my favorite New Yorker cartoons in the last 5 years was the one with the caption, "You know you're getting old when you recognize neither the host nor the musical guest on Saturday Night Live." That turns out to be true for me far too many Saturdays. The key year in the transition from AM to FM was 1969, and the key radio station in that transition was this one. Good to know some of you still remember those hallowed call letters. Now fresh 1027. Oh, I just think of feminine hygiene products whenever I think of our old 1027. This is an ad that we did to illustrate the difference, and it pretty much tells the story, because that's the way it was. You graduated from WABC and the Good Guys and the All-Americans and Top 40 to FM radio. And, wow. That looks like a lineup on any episode of Law and Order SVU or whatever. But you may not know their faces, but you know their voices and their names. From the left, that's Dennis Elsis, the late Allison Steele, Dick Neer, the late Scott Muni, Dave Herman, old what's his name, and my friend on the end is Vin Scelsa. And we had quite a ride, and we can talk about this later in the question and answer period, but the fact is that we thought it would go on forever, and of course, nothing ever does. But while it was happening, it was quite a ride. 1969 was also the year of Woodstock. Are you ready to go to Woodstock? Yeah. Another wardrobe change. That's better. My own journey to Woodstock actually began many, many, many years before 1969. In fact, right there. When I was 8 or 9 years old, I knew that I wanted to play records on the radio. What annoys me today is that when we do this show at a high school, or sometimes even a community college, I have to explain what the hell that thing is in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. At WFUV, where I currently work, they still have 2 turntables, and their main function is holding the pizza boxes that the digital downloading kids bring with them on the weekend. Then when I was a teenager, I would kill today for that hair. But when I was a teenager, Elvis had happened, so now I knew that not only did I want to play records on the radio, but I wanted to play rock and roll records on the radio, and I got the chance to do that when I enrolled at Fordham University in the 60s and began my first go-around with one of the first non-commercial educational radio stations in the country, WFUV-FM. Then in 1969, through some combination of luck, talent, determination, and being in the right place at the right time, I was hired by the most influential FM rock radio station in the country. You saw their call letters earlier. And I got the chance to do exactly what I wanted to do and continue to do 40 years later. The late comedian George Burns once said, "Find something you love to do and you'll never work a day in your life." Guilty as charged, Your Honor. If they came after me on that one, I'd just have to put my hands out and let them put the cuffs on me. Oddly enough, on my first night at WNEW-FM in July of 1969, this is how the book starts, so I think I'm going to do a quick reading from Back to the Garden. Just after midnight on July 27, 1969, 20 minutes into my debut program at WNEW-FM in New York, I did my first live commercial. As instructed during orientation, I looked at the program log, opened up the alphabetized copybook in front of me, and rifled through it until I came to the W's. When the vinyl record on the turntable to my right ended, I turned on the mic switch and did a quick back sell of the music I had just played. Sing This All Together by the Rolling Stones, All Together Now by the Beatles, and You Can All Join In by Traffic. I then proceeded to read these exact words from that copybook. Before I play this for you, I just want to say, especially referencing Mike's introduction, that before joining NEW-FM, I was teaching at Maria Regina High School in Uniondale, Long Island. And let's see, the reason for that was it was, after all, 1969, and I needed the deferment. I didn't particularly like radio in Canada, so I thought it was the lesser of two evils. But one of my students stayed up that first night with a handheld microphone held up to a table radio plugged into a Wollensak reel-to-reel tape recorder, and that's the only reason why what you're about to hear exists 41 years later.
Woodstock Music and Art Fair, the three-day Aquarian Exposition at White Lake in the town of Bethel, Sullivan County, New York. Friday, August 15th, you'll hear and see Joan Baez, Arlo Guthrie, Tim Hardin, Richie Havens, the incredible string band, Ravi Shankar, Sweetwater. Then on Saturday, August 16th, it's Canned Heat, Creedence Clearwater, Grateful Dead, Keith Hartley, Janis Joplin, the Jefferson Airplane, Mountain, Santana, and the Who, the hottest groups on the scene right now. Sunday, August 17th, the band, Jeff Beck, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Iron Butterfly, Joe Cocker, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, Jimi Hendrix, the Moody Blues, Johnny Winter, and that's not all. Tickets are available by mail or at your local ticket agency for any one day at $7, 2 days at $14, and for all 3 days, just $18. A special two-day ticket is available by mail only for $13. For tickets and information, you can write the Woodstock Music and Arts Fair, Box 996, Radio City Station, New York 10019, or phone Murray Hill 70700 MU70700. Remember, the Woodstock Music and Art Fair is being held at White Lake in the town of Bethel, Sullivan County, New York. They've had their hassles, but it looks like everything's going to be okay.
$18 for that lineup for 3 days? $18 is what you pay today Ticketmaster for that $250 ticket that you're not even sure you want. Things have changed dramatically and badly in the last 4 decades. Some of our older visitors today might have noticed that there were 3 groups mentioned in that commercial that did not appear at Woodstock. Tony, can we see the first 2? Okay, we got the Jeff Beck group, who had broken up about a week and a half before Woodstock, so obviously they weren't going to be there. However, their keyboard player, an English musician by the name of Nicky Hopkins, did go to the festival and ended up playing with the Jefferson Airplane on Sunday morning. Grace Slick introduces him in her Morning Maniac music speech. Then we've got the Moody Blues. Now, the Moody Blues did agree to appear at Woodstock, but they never signed the contract. And when they realized that it was going to cost them more to interrupt their tour in Europe, come to upstate New York, and then go back to resume the tour, they never did sign the contract. As far as I'm concerned, however, the most interesting story of all involves the third group that didn't appear. Did anybody catch who it was? A hint? In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. Well, not only were Iron Butterfly scheduled to appear at the festival, but they did fly into New York. And here's a telegram that they sent to the stage manager, one of the unsung heroes of the event, a gentleman by the name of John Morris. They wrote this telegram to John, quote, "We have arrived at LaGuardia Airport. You will have a helicopter pick us up. We will fly straight to the show. We will perform immediately, and then we will be flown right out after the performance." Now, in the midst of the chaos and confusion in Bethel, where no act, even the biggest of the headliners, went on when or where they were supposed to, John Morris had the presence of mind and the sense of humor to answer that telegram with one of his own. It read, "For reasons I can't go into until you are here clarifying your situation, knowing you are having problems, you'll have to find other transportation unless you plan not to come." Sounds pretty reasonable, right? Until you take a look at the way John and a co-conspirator at Western Union crafted the actual telegram. I always take a short pause here because it takes a while sometimes to roll to the back of the room, but that is what I meant by John Morris being one of the unsung heroes. Goodbye, Iron Butterfly. All right, those are three groups that didn't appear at Woodstock. The next thing I want to do is show you three movie stars from the time who, on paper, shouldn't have had any connection to Woodstock at all, yet each one of them did. And the first one up is this guy. Now, oddly enough, all three of them had made Westerns in their career, perhaps none as prominently as John Wayne. And we tell the story in the book through the eyes of the guy who was the sound engineer on Woodstock the movie and who today is in charge of Neil Young's archives of his audio recordings and films and videos. His name is Larry Johnson, and Larry told us the following. So we were on the Warner lot, and Michael Wadley, the director of the film, says to me, John Wayne and his son Michael Wayne want to see our system, so go meet them. I go down to the gate where they're coming in and bring them back to the thing. And there's John Wayne with a suit and a hat. And I have this long hair. And I'm wearing this jumpsuit. And I come up to him with my hand out. And he goes, I want to see your hippie ass off this lot in 5 minutes. Pilgrim. He didn't say Pilgrim. I just put that in for authenticity. But Wayne did say Pilgrim a lot in his movies. There's no doubt about that.
Think you can make it, Pilgrim? Hey, Pilgrim, you're gonna need a couple of stitches. Well, don't fret about that, Pilgrim. Like I say, Pilgrim, you can eat here till you get back on your feet. Well, thanks for saving my life, Pilgrim. Hey, Pilgrim. Pilgrim. Pilgrim.
And that's all from just one movie. Anybody know which one? No John Wayne fans anymore. Boy, fame is ephemeral, isn't it? It was a film called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And in fact, there's another connection to Top 40 in that film. The song written as the theme for it was a big, big hit for an artist by the name of Gene Pitney. But an even better trivia question is, do you know who wrote The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance? Hal David and Burt Bacharach, who went on to incredible success as a songwriting team. And the other irony is that the producer of the film ultimately decided not to use it on the soundtrack. So even though it did become a hit, when the thing runs on cable, AMC, or I don't watch AMC anymore because of the commercials, but Turner Classic Movies is the place to see old films if you're into them. No commercial interruptions. But you won't hear Gene Pitney's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance when that one runs on the tube. Who's our second cowboy, Tony? I'm sorry? Oh, you want me to do that? Okay, I'll do that. The rest of the John Wayne story is simply this. He was kidding. He said, I'm just kidding. Michael told me to say that. He was real interested in movie making, and we had these editing machines, and none of them had ever been seen in Hollywood. And we had 3 of them. It was about to break through and make editing a whole new thing in Hollywood. So people would come through because Michael was so technically advanced. And 1969 was also the year that John Wayne gave his bravura performance that won an Academy Award for True Grit, which I'm going to say Lloyd Bridges, but it's his son Jeff who replayed the role in a big hit movie last year and also was nominated for an Academy Award but lost to a stutterer, if you can imagine such a thing. But second cowboy. Anybody? Okay. Roy Rogers, King of the Cowboys. You can't make this up. If this had been submitted to me as fiction, I would have rejected it as being unbelievable. But the truth is that the promoters of the Woodstock Festival originally offered the closing spot on the whole show to Roy Rogers. Now, here is why. They thought it would be a clever idea to have a baby boomer hero who had a song that everybody could sing along with to shut down the whole shebang.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you till we meet again.
Roy turned them down. And if you're like me and believe that things that are supposed to happen happen and things that aren't supposed to happen don't happen, I think it worked out the way it was supposed to. Because on the one hand, you got Roy Rogers and Happy Trails. On the other hand, you got Jimi Hendrix and the Star-Spangled Banner. I think Woodstock ended the way that it was supposed to. Third actor. Moses. Ben-Hur, Charlton Heston. This one I can show you with your own eyes and ears. I'm sorry, that's just borderline creepy. Anybody know what movie that's from? Not Andromeda. Not Planet of the Apes. One more? Okay. No, it's not Soylent Green either. 4 wrong guesses. That's a first. It usually goes to after people say Soylent Green, which is Soylent Green are people. It usually goes to one of the others mentioned, and then someone comes up with Omega Man. Omega Man also was remade a couple of years ago, only the guy who made it went back to the original title. He didn't call it Omega Man. He called it after the book that it was based on, called I Am Legend. And that was, of course, Will Smith, correct? One of the questions that I am asked most often is, what my impressions were of being up there that weekend with all the mud and the rain and the people and all of that. And it's really a funny answer because I was not at Woodstock. As I said to you earlier, I had just gotten the job at WNEW-FM, and the program director said, somebody's going to have to stay here to do fill-ins and news reports. You're elected. And when you're the new kid on the block, you really don't have that much bargaining power with the program director. So I literally spent that weekend shuttling news reports back and forth from the WNEW-AM newsroom to the WNEW-FM studio. But it was during those hours that I just made up my mind that any time I had the opportunity to sit down with someone who had been at the festival, either backstage, on stage, or in the audience, that I would get their story. And I originally intended it for radio specials, which I did every significant anniversary up to and including the 40th in 2009. But my oldest son, who decided not to go into the family business, he went into publishing instead. And we had done a book about Simon and Garfunkel's album Bookends that I spoke about the last time I was here at Queensboro 2 years ago. And we had such a good time doing that he said, do you want to do another one? And I said, what do you got? And he said, 2009 is the 40th anniversary of the Woodstock Festival. And I said, Woodstock? I've got half the book done already. And that was literally true. I had boxes upon boxes of reel-to-reel tapes, which we had to have digitized and then transcribed. But those tapes made up the substance of what we call the oral history part of our book, Back to the Garden. And so I'm very glad, in a sense, not to have been there because it made me obsessive about researching it and treating it as the historical event that it was, that it is, and that it always will be. Another thing that happened that weekend, by today's standards, media was very primitive. We had one reporter from WNEW-AM who was assigned the job of going up and covering the festival on Friday night after it had grown from a local music story to a regional news story to a national news story to an international news story. His name was Mike Eisgrau, and he filed a couple of reports from the event that at the time made the hair on my wrist stand up because I thought he was using radio as theater of the mind better than just about anyone else who reported on the event.
This sight isn't hard to believe. We're over White Lake in the midst of this music festival encampment. We're up over the trees now, and we're coming in over the top of the main stage of this music festival. And for easily a half a mile, all we can see on this hilltop are people. 50, 100, possibly 200,000 people sitting there, the music going on day and night, and despite the rain, despite the mud, despite the water, and despite the hardship, these people apparently are going to stick it out.
When we landed, the first youngster I saw was completely naked. I said to him, "Pardon me, young man," as I whipped out my microphone, "don't you feel a bit peculiar in what you're not wearing?" He said, "Hey, baby man," he said, "me." He says, "What about you?" It was at that point, standing in the mud of Max Yasgur's farm, that I realized I'd gone so fast I was standing at Woodstock in a tie and jacket.
While we're on the subject of very talented news journalists, this next segment was always meant to start with a question. This is once again one of those dividing line questions. Who in 1969 was described as the most trusted man in America? Walter Cronkite. And while we were preparing the show in 2009, Mr. Cronkite passed away, so we've turned this segment of the show into a tribute to him because at the end of 1969, Walter Cronkite filed his report about the Woodstock Music and Art Fair for the CBS network.
27 days after Tranquility Base, on an untranquil sea of mud at 42.02 degrees north, 74.08 degrees west, there was a walk in space that 400,000 long-haired pilgrims in and out of sweatshirts called the greatest weekend since the creation. It came to be known as the Woodstock Nation, in search of rock, acid, pot, peace, and just being together. 400,000 Americans between 15 and 25 flocked to Max Yasgur's dairy farm at Bethel, New York, for a weekend with Sly and the Family Stone, Country Joe and the Fish, Janis Joplin, the Jefferson Airplane, Santana, Crosby, Stills and Nash, The Who, Joan Baez, and Arlo Guthrie, among others. The festival was declared a disaster area, and if there had been a riot, the commission that would have investigated it would have probably blamed negligent planning by the promoters, lack of water, food, medical and sanitary facilities, and stormy weather. It would have cited also the abundance of marijuana, some hard drugs, communal living, and the exploitation of thousands of turned-away ticket holders who never got their $18 back. Yet there was no violence, relatively little illness for a population of this size. 3 people died, 2 were born, and in a rare happening, even the police got rave notices. There was some paranoia. The establishment was blamed by some for having seeded the clouds, causing the downpour. Some critics of the festival called it an orgy organized by the communists, and the promoters ended up suing each other. At the end, Farmer Yasgur stood on center stage and saluted the multitude.
Now, I couldn't prove this, so it's not in the book. We didn't put anything in that we couldn't document. But one person I interviewed swore to me that he saw Spiro Agnew in a crop duster somewhere in the vicinity of Bethel that weekend. Couldn't prove it, not in the book. Another reason that I love playing that report is just to hear Walter Cronkite say, Country Joe and the Fish, the Jefferson Airplane. He could have been a weekend guy at WNEW-FM in a heartbeat. Might have made the wrong career choice, I'm not sure. and we'll never know. A couple of more things before we go to questions and answers. The first is to put to rest a rumor about the festival, and it involves these guys. Now, as you know, and as you can see from this picture, the Beatles were outstanding in their field. I'm always glad that there's a podium around when I use that line. But the reason that I use it is because not a single Beatle was outstanding in Max Yasgur's field. But that doesn't mean the Beatles weren't at Woodstock. They may not have been there physically, but the Beatles were at Woodstock. They were there in Richie Havens' performance of Strawberry Fields Forever. They were certainly there in Joe Cocker's With a Little Help from My Friends. And maybe most of all, they were there in the core of every single person who attended the festival and who passed that DNA on to all people like my son, who was born 3 years after Woodstock and edited this book, but weren't around when Woodstock actually happened. Now, to illustrate what I mean, I'd like to give you an example of how the Beatles have continued to inspire, influence, and entertain us all. Let's just roll it, Tony. The man's name is Chris Bliss. That was recorded at the Beacon Theater in New York at one of the annual tributes that they do to John Lennon in December on the anniversary of his murder, the 30th anniversary of which was just this past December, if you can believe that. The first time that I saw that, there were tears streaming down my face, and I couldn't explain why. And then a friend of mine said, you don't have to explain why. You either get it or you don't, as far as the Beatles are concerned. But I rest my case. The Beatles were, in some way, maybe not outstanding in that field, but the Beatles were at Woodstock. Finally, as I said earlier, we didn't put anything in the book that we couldn't prove. For example, the actual existence of a Woodstock baby who would be 41 years old now. You hear about it anecdotally. Cronkite even referred to it in his report. But the fact of the matter is there are no documents proving the existence of a Woodstock baby. There are certificates for the 3 deaths, 2 drug overdoses and 1 poor soul who was run over by a tractor in his sleeping bag, but no birth certificates on record. And when you think about it, it makes sense. Because don't you think that if there was a Woodstock baby that he or she would have their own reality show on the Fox network, and they'd be selling all kinds of Woodstock baby bibs, Woodstock baby blankets, and so on and so on? I think so. There was one mystery about Woodstock that we were able to resolve. And I have no problem acknowledging that if it weren't for the sophistication of technology in the 4 decades from Woodstock to today, this would not have been possible. If it weren't for computers and the World Wide Web, we could not have solved this one last mystery that has been plaguing historians for 4 decades. And that is just exactly what the hell was Joe Cocker saying on that stage 40 years ago. Mystery solved. We have learned that there's really no way to follow what we affectionately refer to as this dog and pony show after that. So let me do a couple of things and then take some questions. First is to say that this might not surprise you by this point, but I'm something of a tech Neanderthal. I wrote this book using Bic pens and yellow legal pads. If it weren't for my partner in crime, there would be no Woodstock Dog and Tony Show. Dog and Tony Show. Dog and Pony Show. His name is Tony Triguardo, and he's right here. Please say hello. Tony also does he wears many hats. He's on the board of directors of the Long Island Music Hall of Fame, runs the media department at the Port Washington Library on Long Island, and also does a podcast called the Fab Forum, all about the Beatles, which you can dial up at fabforum.com or iTunes, for that matter. Then there's this website, that I discovered a while ago called nyradioarchive.com. If you have strong feelings about the kind of radio we've been talking about today, or if as a student you want to learn more about it, where it came from, how it impacted people's lives, and what went wrong in the end, you can dial it up at nyradioarchive.com. They don't want to sell you anything. They just want to preserve the best of what that kind of radio is all about. The only one here to sell you something today is me, and that's the paperback of Back to the Garden. It's $15. I'll be glad to inscribe it for anyone after we are done with the Q&A period outside at that table to the left of those doors. And what Mother's Day coming up, Father's Day, Arbor Day, what else? Any questions? Let me get my glasses back so I can see them. Search the room. When my experience at this goes right back to the days at Maria Regina. I would ask a question. I would say, how many of you had lunch today? And they'd give me this. They'd always be, you'd have to get affirmed by someone before you'd dare to raise your hand. Somebody was close right here, yeah.
Just a quick story. I was 14 in 1969, and growing up in the Bronx, I did want to go to Woodstock, and my immigrant Puerto Rican mother wouldn't let me go to hang out with those long hairs and those people that don't shower. She said that in Spanish. But I do have a question. I did go there in spirit, as I'm still there today, as we all are. What happened to Bob Dylan? Why wasn't he there? Wasn't he from Woodstock?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the original reason for having the festival up in that neighborhood was because Dylan lived in the town of Woodstock. But the town fathers threw them out right away. They didn't want, not even knowing that it was going to be as big as it was, they didn't want an event like that in their town. So it moved to another place called Wallkill, right, Tony? And they were setting up there, but a month before, in July, they got thrown out of there as well. And finally, the result was that they ended up in a town called Bethel. And that's where the hero of the piece, the hero of the story, is a dairy farmer by the name of Max Yasgur, who allowed his land to be used for the festival. Today, it is a museum and a summer concert venue, much like Tanglewood or SPAC up in Saratoga. It's a great place to see a show in the summer. They do all kinds of music, from classical to Tony Bennett to veterans of the actual Woodstock event. And the museum is, anybody been there? Anybody been to the museum at Bethel Woods? It's a state-of-the-art museum, but it's not just Woodstock. It's a civics lesson about the 60s. It starts with JFK's election in 1960 and goes all the way up to the anti-Woodstock at the end of 1969. Few people make the connection that, let's see, Woodstock, August, September, October, November, December. 4 months later, there was an event that almost canceled out all of the good vibes of Woodstock, which was Altamont, the Rolling Stones' free concert at Altamont, at which the Hells Angels were hired for security. What were they thinking? Oh, my God. Dylan, he lived in Woodstock. By that time, he was very tired of stalkers and curiosity seekers just trespassing on his property and bothering the hell out of him. Now, there was reason to believe that he would appear because the band was there, and they were his backup band at the time, and because Albert Grossman was his manager, and he also managed the band and Janis Joplin, who were both at the festival. But true to his contrary ways, Bob passed on the festival and instead went to England a month later and appeared at the Isle of Wight Festival in front of 750,000 people. But right up to Jimi Hendrix's last note on Monday morning, there were people expecting that Bob Dylan would be at Woodstock. We do tell that story in the book as well. Somebody else?
Do you still keep in contact with Howard Stern?
Sorry?
You still keep in contact with Howard Stern?
Sure. I work at, we use that piece now, not only because he looks like such a nerd, but because Howard is a Jekyll and Hyde. His radio persona has absolutely nothing to do with what he is like as a human being off the radio. So we got along great. But what I learned with Howard was, with Howard, it's out of sight, out of mind. If he sees you, he'll draw you into the studio and singe the hairs on your beard. If he doesn't see you, his target is someone else. So I learned the layout. I went to the engineers of the building and learned the layout of K-Rock so that if he was leaving the studio and going left, I would be coming completely from the right, or vice versa. So I think there was a year there where I didn't see him at all, and I felt this is the way to handle Howard when he's on the air. When he's off the air, he's a pussycat. Somebody else? Tony, right behind you, the other way.
Well, it's nice to know that somebody was almost at Woodstock. I'd like to say that I was at Woodstock.
A veteran. You got a story? You got a story?
I was 19 at the time. I was working in a summer camp upstate. It was my day off, and I went with a couple of the other counselors, and we spent about a day and a half there, not the full 3 days. It was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. The rain, the mud, the music, the people, it was just amazing. It was an amazing, amazing time those days also. So I don't know if anybody else in the audience was
Any other vets?
Any other?
Got a story for us? Hold on.
Just a lot of rain and mud and crowds, and I walked back and forth on the road that led up to the concert. My friends and I were staying in a boarding house nearby that our parents had a connection to. Couldn't get anywhere near the stage, but I do remember the music. It was a great experience.
Specific music that you remember?
Jimi Hendrix, Ravi Shankar. Yeah.
Just to affirm what this gentleman said earlier, one of the things that I've concluded after all of these years and all of this research is that there was never anything like it before. There hasn't really been anything like it since, nor could there ever be again in our post-9/11 world. It's that simple. The security line alone would go from Bethel down to Midtown Manhattan. It just was one of those. One of the things I do in the book is I call it. I don't think the term was in use at the time, but what did they say in weather when those three things? Perfect storm. It was a perfect storm of the social climate at the time, meaning the Vietnam War, civil rights, feminism, rock and roll having come from its basic 50s roots into a maturity in the mid to late 60s that I think was unparalleled and remains so to this day. And the third thing was that group that is unfortunately placed under that umbrella called baby boomers, for maybe the first time recognizing how big their numbers were and how mighty their powers might be. Now, I'll qualify that by saying many of the promises of Woodstock went unfulfilled in the decades after. But there is no question about the fact, as that gentleman pointed out, that in that moment, people felt its importance, people felt its magic, and if they experienced it directly or vicariously, they still do to this day. Anybody else? One or two, way, way back.
How did people, I come a little bit late, so I'm not sure if you know this, but how did people know that the event was coming? Was there advertising that it was in Bethel and Woodstock? How did they?
In those days, there was what they call the underground press. The underground press included the Village Voice in New York City. I forget the name of the Boston paper. Is anybody from Boston here? Boston Phoenix? Is it the Boston Phoenix? That was their underground paper. Rolling Stone magazine, which had started up in 1967, was also a venue for that kind of information. And there are also what they used to call, and this always made me laugh, they used to call WNEW-FM an underground radio station. Really? Broadcasting from the tower of the Empire State Building in New York City to the entire tri-state area? That's underground? That commercial that you must have missed it. That's right. The thing we opened with was a commercial that I did for the festival in July of 1969. At that time, in that month, on the 4th of July weekend, there was a festival in Atlantic City, New Jersey, with many of the same acts that appeared at Woodstock. And it attracted a crowd of 75,000, 80,000 people. That's what the promoters were expecting up in Bethel. And instead, they got 5 times that. 400 to 500,000 is the estimate that most people are satisfied with or feel that they can verify. There was nothing to explain until that Friday night when the hordes descended that it was going to be what it was, as big as it was, as influential as it was. Another reason why I say nothing like it before, nothing like it since, nothing like it again. Yes, sir?
I was staying at a bungalow colony along the road there on 17, where we were right next door to the Estamana Hotel, which was owned by Esther Strasberg, whose son-in-law is Neil Sedaka. And they were using the pitch and putt course in the front for landing helicopters before going to the concert. But when you say there was no feeling that the concert was going to be as big as it was until Friday, seems out of place with my recollection of it. At the point in time, 17 was a two-way road going each way, so you had 4 lanes of traffic. By Thursday, the traffic was stopped. You moved maybe 50 feet in 2 hours, and it was 6 lanes going in one direction only, towards the festival. So my experience before I took off and walked up the road to go there, I had some friends who were working at the local Y here, the Samuel Field Y, and they had invitation to do something as their treat for being counselors that summer, and they chose going to the festival. So there were a whole bunch of them in a minivan or a van, and we were there Thursday, and like I said, the road was packed already Thursday to say that, and they were already talking about the thruway being shut, it was overwhelmed, whatever. So we were handing out water to people because they had nothing, it was a long schlep. My friend was in the back of the van, and I had no clue. I had another friend who was on the outside. You know, we gave him water. We said, hi, how you doing? They kept going. I get home at the end of the summer. I run into my friend. We're talking about the experience. And he says, yeah. I said, hey, you know, I saw Jack. He was in the van. He says, yeah, I was in the back. I said, I was handing out the water. He says, I had no idea who it was from. I told everyone, don't touch it. So that was the connection I had. But I met people from Georgia, people who were coming from the state of Washington. They were coming from all over the United States to attend this. And by Thursday, the road was closed. I mean, you were parking on lawns, you were parking on the side of the highway. There was no way to move anywhere.
According to the New York Times, it wasn't until Friday that the New York State Thruway is closed, man. And that, remember what I said earlier? It started out as a local story, grew to a regional, then a national, and then an international. Well, the proof was on Friday, the group that was supposed to open, just like Jimmy wasn't supposed to close it, Richie Havens wasn't supposed to open Woodstock. He was billed 5th on Friday afternoon into the evening. Anybody know the group that was supposed to open? They're from California. They had some FM play at the time, but they never really sustained their success. They were a group called Sweetwater. VH1 did a made-for-TV movie about them maybe about 10 years ago. Sweetwater was on their tour bus stuck on the New York Thruway on Friday. No cell phones, no texting. They stopped at a service station on the New York Thruway and called that man I mentioned earlier, John Morris, to say, there's no way we're going to get here by 4 o'clock to kick this thing off. And that's when the promoters went into a frenzy. Their thought was, the Friday acts were the more folk acoustic acts to begin with. But they thought the best thing we could do is get somebody with the least equipment on that stage to perform. And their first choice was a great singer-songwriter, but a troubled soul by the name of Tim Hardin. You probably know songs he has written more than you know Tim Hardin as a performer. But he was just stoned out of his mind and terrified and hid under the stage rather than open the show. The promoters imposed upon Richie Havens, who basically had conga drum player and another guitarist, and it was the three of them. And Richie's story, which he tells in the first person in the book, is just wonderful. There were moments that happened up there that almost have, I like to think of it almost as divine intervention. Let me just tell you two quick ones. Remember what I said about it originally was going to be Woodstock. They moved to the other town and then finally ended up in Bethel. One of the Hebrew definitions or translations of Bethel is a sacred place. If you've ever been to the site and you stand at the monument that overlooks the field where the concert took place, you really do have that feeling. It almost washes over you. In Richie's case, they just kept pushing him out. They didn't have a second act ready. He said he sang everything he knew, and they still pushed him out for another encore. And the song that he is most famous for, Freedom, incorporating the hymn Motherless Child in the middle of, he made it up on stage. I mean, talk about rising to a moment. I don't think there is one better than that. One other thing that I think is worthy of mentioning is that I think that people's memories of Woodstock and the world's knowledge of Woodstock is based more upon the movie than it is upon the actual event. Now, what do I mean by that? If you didn't allow your music to be used on the album or your performance to be used in the film, it's hardly even known that you were there. Some of the biggest acts in rock and roll were at Woodstock, but nobody knows. Creedence Clearwater Revival. Fogerty wasn't happy with the performance, wouldn't let them be in the film, didn't happen. The one that's most bizarre is Blood, Sweat, and Tears. The group Blood, Sweat, and Tears that summer had the biggest album in the country, their second album. Their first album was called Child is Father to the Man. Al Cooper, who founded the band, managed to get fired from his own group. And the second album was the one with David Clayton Thomas as the lead singer. There were 5 top 40 singles from that album. You Made Me So Very Happy, And When I Die, Spinning Wheel. But it also got great play on FM radio because it had those long tracks like Blues Part 2 and variations on a theme by Eric Satie. So in a sense, there was not a bigger group that summer than Blood, Sweat, and Tears. In fact, in 1970, their album beat Abbey Road as Album of the Year at the Grammys. Well, when they went around trying to get the contract signed to be in the movie, the producers were offering what they call a favored nations deal. Everybody who was in the movie was going to get the same amount of money. Blood, Sweat, and Tears manager said, no, we're bigger, we get more. The producer said, no, I'm sorry, can't do it. Manager said, turn those cameras off, you're not filming my guys. Bad career decision, because it's 41 years later and now nobody knows or cares that Blood, Sweat, and Tears was at Woodstock. And the fairy tale, the best one of all, Santana. Santana didn't even have their first album out. It wasn't scheduled for release until September of 1969. How did they get on this big show? Well, they were managed by Bill Graham of the Fillmore East fame. Bill Graham also managed the Grateful Dead. He was a bargainer. He went to the promoters and said, "You want the Grateful Dead? Okay, I'll give you the Grateful Dead, but you got to put my guys on at a good time where they can be seen by whoever's going to be there." I think that performance of Soul Sacrifice is a defining moment in popular music. It has lost none of its power, originality. You know, it's 41 years later, and it's still the great moment in the film, and the moment that launched Carlos Santana into an incredible 41-year career. Alvin Lee of 10 Years After told me when I interviewed him for the book, before Woodstock, we were playing clubs. After Woodstock, we were playing theaters. After the Woodstock movie, we were playing arenas. And that was the growth curve for the artists who did manage to, become part of that film and part of the iconic imagery that it still maintains. To make sense of all this, it was a huge, in some ways it was a huge project to undertake because some people's recollections are cloudy for various and sundry reasons that we won't go into. That's why I asked this young lady if she had any specific musical memories. But, for example, I spoke to 8 people who were involved in the negotiations with Max Yasgur about using his property for the festival. And they each told 8 incredibly contradictory stories, all about some of the same basic stuff, the when and the where and the how that they got to do what they did. So that threw me for a loop until I realized there's a great Japanese movie from the 50s by Akira Kurosawa called Rashomon. There is something called the Rashomon effect. Rashomon tells the story of a murder in Japan witnessed by 4 people. And then the film tells the story from each one of those 4 people's point of view. And every one of them is different, from how the murder occurred, to what the murder weapon was, to what the motive was. And that is now used in court. It's called the Rashomon effect. And it's used in court to illustrate how unreliable eyewitness testimony can be. So that was the problem I had, trying to sift the truth out of all of these different variations on certain things that you would think had A, B, C, D actual facts. And then what inspired me was a quote that I found from the author Joseph Campbell. Do you know who he is? Joseph Campbell, wrote a book called The Power of Myth, which George Lucas used to base his Star Wars series on. The dark side of the Force, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And here's what Campbell said. Quote, "People say that what we're all seeking is a meaning for life. I don't think that's what we're really seeking. I think what we're seeking is an experience of being alive, so that our life experiences on the purely physical plane will have resonances within our own innermost being and reality, so that we actually feel the rapture of being alive. Apart from everything else you can say about it, Woodstock made us feel the rapture of being alive." And I want to thank all of you for making me feel some of that rapture today here at Queensborough Community College. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Pete. And Pete will be outside for a meet and greet, and his book will be available for any of you who may wish to purchase it. Thank you.